It didn't happen when things were casual. It didn't happen when it was still undefined. It didn't happen when you were unsure where you stood. It happened the moment it felt real, the moment their eyes softened just a little longer, the moment the silence between you felt safe instead of tense, the moment you stopped performing and started existing. That's when something shifted, not in you, in them. Because casual connection doesn't activate the nervous system, but real attachment does. And when attachment activates in someone who learned that closeness equals danger, their body doesn't register love, it registers threat. You have to understand something most people never say out loud. Avoidant distancing doesn't begin when they lose feelings. It begins when feelings become undeniable, when intimacy stops being theoretical and becomes embodied, when you become someone whose absence would hurt. That's the moment their system starts scanning for escape routes, not because you are unsafe, but because needing someone once cost them something, and the body does not forget what the mind has minimized. When you became real to them, you crossed an invisible threshold. You stopped being pleasant company. You became attachment. Attachment is not romantic. Attachment is primal. It activates the same survival wiring that once decided who was safe to depend on and who wasn't. If their early blueprint taught them that closeness leads to overwhelm, that vulnerability leads to criticism, that needing someone leads to disappointment, then intimacy doesn't feel like warmth. It feels like exposure. And exposure feels dangerous to a nervous system trained to self-protect. You probably noticed it subtly at first. They became slightly less available, slightly slower to respond, slightly more focused on work, slightly more irritated by normal emotional needs. You told yourself they were just busy, stressed, processing. But underneath those small shifts was something deeper happening. Your presence was no longer neutral. It mattered. And when you matter to someone who survives through emotional distance, their body begins preparing for loss before loss even exists. That's the part most people miss. Avoidant withdrawal is anticipatory protection. It is the body saying, if this person becomes essential and they leave, it will destroy us. So the system does something subtle. It reduces dependency before dependency forms. It creates space before closeness deepens. It starts narrating flaws where there were none, not because the flaws appeared, but because distance needs justification. And once the nervous system enters threat mode, the brain will cooperate. It will scan for reasons. Reasons you're not compatible. Reasons you're too emotional. Reasons this is moving too fast. Reasons something feels off. What feels off is not you. It's the activation of attachment. You became real. Real means you could hurt them. Real means you could leave. Real means they could lose control. And control is how they regulate. For someone avoidant, control equals safety. Control of time. Control of access. Control of emotional exposure. When you entered their life casually, they had control. They could engage. They could retreat. They could feel without consequence. But once you mattered, once their chest tightened, at the thought of you pulling away, once your absence created even a flicker of anxiety, that control weakened. And the body does not like losing its primary survival strategy. So it does what it has always done. It distances, not dramatically at first, subtly, gradually, almost politely, because the system isn't trying to punish you. It's trying to restore equilibrium. But here's what makes this so painful. From your perspective, things were finally becoming solid. There was depth, Consistency. Shared vulnerability. You felt chosen. You felt seen. You felt safe enough to soften. And the moment you softened, they stiffened. This is not coincidence. This is nervous system choreography. When one person moves toward secure attachment and the other is wired for self-protection, intimacy creates asymmetry. Your openness feels grounding to you. It feels engulfing to them. Your consistency feels stabilizing to you. It feels binding to them. Your desire for clarity feels mature to you. It feels like pressure to them, not because you demand it, but because attachment itself demands presence, and presence requires emotional availability. Emotional availability requires tolerating vulnerability, and vulnerability activates old wounds. When you became real to them, you didn't become a burden. You became a mirror. You reflected their capacity for connection and also their fear of it. This is the moment many avoidants experience what feels like confusion. They may genuinely care deeply, but the body begins sending mixed signals: longing and resistance, closeness and irritation, affection and withdrawal. It feels chaotic internally. And when something feels chaotic inside, they create structure outside. Distance becomes structure. Silence becomes structure. Busyness becomes structure. Criticism becomes structure. Because chaos feels like losing control, and losing control feels like danger. You might replay the last weeks over and over, looking for the mistake, the conversation, the tone shift, the moment you said too much. But what if nothing went wrong? What if the only thing that changed was that you crossed from pleasant to essential? When you are pleasant, you can be enjoyed. When you are essential, you can be lost. And loss is what their nervous system is built to avoid at all costs. This is why their leaving often feels sudden, because the internal buildup is invisible to you. They may have been fighting it for weeks, trying to calm the discomfort, trying to rationalize staying, trying to convince themselves they are overthinking. But the body is louder than logic. If closeness once equaled pain, the body will choose distance. Before the mind finishes debating, you became real to them, which means you reached a place no one reaches without triggering history. And history is not about you. It is about what intimacy once meant. For some, intimacy meant intrusion. For others, it meant unpredictability. For others, it meant being needed too much, or not being needed at all. Whatever their imprint was, you activated it, not because you were wrong, but because you were significant. That is the paradox. The deeper the attachment, the stronger the threat response. For someone who equates love with instability, they may not even consciously understand it. They just know that something shifted when it started to feel permanent, when you talked about the future, and it felt less hypothetical, when routines formed, when habits formed, when emotional reliance formed. That is when the nervous system whispered, "This is becoming real." And real means vulnerable. Vulnerable means exposed. Exposed means at risk. And if risk once meant hurt, the body will retreat, even from something beautiful. You didn't scare them with your intensity. You didn't push them away with your needs. You didn't overwhelm them with love. You crossed into relevance. And relevance is terrifying to someone who survives by staying emotionally autonomous. Here's the part that hurts most. They might still think about you, miss you, feel relief and regret at the same time, because leaving reduced the activation, but it did not erase the attachment. It just made it manageable. Distance lowers intensity, and intensity is what their system could not regulate. So if you're sitting there, wondering why everything changed, right when it felt secure. Understand this. Security to you may have felt like entrapment to a nervous system that equates love with losing itself. You became real, and real love does not test surface compatibility. It tests internal capacity. Not everyone has built the capacity to stay. That doesn't make you too much. It means you reached a depth they were not yet equipped to tolerate. And the moment you reached that depth, their system chose survival over connection, not because you were unworthy, but because intimacy activated something they never learned how to soothe. And that activation is where the leaving began. When intimacy activates in someone avoidant, it does not feel like warmth. It feels like pressure, not pressure from you, pressure from inside their own body. There is a physiological shift most people never see. Their breathing changes, their sleep changes, their thoughts become louder. Not romantic thoughts, threat assessment thoughts. What if this goes wrong? What if I lose myself? What if they expect more? What if I can't sustain this? The deeper the connection grows, the more their system scans for signs of future overwhelm. Because for someone wired toward avoidance, closeness equals responsibility. Responsibility equals exposure. Exposure equals risk. And risk is something they learned to neutralize early. You might think they're just overthinking, but it's not cognitive first. It's somatic first. Their nervous system activates before their logic does. The body tightens, the chest constricts, the desire for space increases, not because you are suffocating them, but because their attachment system is now fully online. And attachment is where their earliest imprints live. When love becomes real, they don't just see you, they subconsciously feel every memory of needing someone and not being met in the way they required, or being met in a way that felt intrusive, or inconsistent, or overwhelming. It doesn't have to be dramatic trauma. It can be subtle. A parent who relied on them emotionally, a caregiver who valued independence over comfort, a household where feelings were inconvenient, a childhood where vulnerability was met with criticism or dismissal. The child learns quickly. Dependence is unsafe. Needing too much is dangerous. Closeness creates instability. So they adapt. They become self-contained, competent, emotionally economical. They build an identity around autonomy, around not needing, around handling things alone. That identity becomes safety. Years later, when you show up with warmth and presence, you don't just offer love, you challenge the structure. That kept them safe, because real intimacy requires interdependence, not dependence, not control, interdependence, which means I matter to you, and you matter to me. That mutual influence is what destabilizes the avoidance system. Influence means impact. Impact means vulnerability. Vulnerability means exposure. And exposure is what their identity was built to avoid. So the moment you became real, they didn't consciously think, I'm going to leave. They thought, this is intense. This is moving fast. I need space. And space feels rational. Space feels responsible. Space feels like self-care. But underneath that narrative is something quieter. If I stay here, I will have to soften. And softening means surrendering control. Avoidants are not cold. They are controlled. They regulate through distance, through minimizing needs, through intellectualizing emotions, instead of feeling them. When you became real, you disrupted that regulation pattern. You invited emotion, presence, depth, future orientation. And future orientation is especially activating because talking about tomorrow means imagining permanence. Imagining permanence means imagining loss, and loss is what their system has been preparing for since childhood. So rather than risk future devastation, the body pulls back before attachment roots too deeply. You might remember a moment when they looked at you with something almost raw, almost exposed, then immediately changed the subject, or joked, or withdrew. That micro shift is the nervous system regulating. Closeness rises, fear follows, distance restores equilibrium. To you, it feels confusing because nothing bad happened. In fact, things felt better than ever. But improvement is exactly what activates them. Because when something becomes valuable, it becomes vulnerable. And vulnerability is what their system equates with danger. You might ask, why pursue love at all if it triggers them? Because the avoidance system still longs for connection. Avoidance is not absence of desire. It is protection against overwhelm. They want love. They just want it at a tolerable distance. They want closeness without dependency, intensity without vulnerability, attachment without loss of autonomy. But real love doesn't function that way. It requires emotional exposure. It requires shared regulation. It requires tolerating uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the most destabilizing states for an avoidant nervous system. When you became real, uncertainty entered, not about whether you cared, but about whether they could sustain the emotional depth you were offering. They may start noticing small flaws, small incompatibilities, tiny irritations, not because those things grew, but because their brain needs justification for the distance their body is craving. The mind serves the nervous system. If the system says threat, the mind finds evidence. This feels too intense. She wants too much. He's too emotional. This isn't balanced. But what feels imbalanced is the internal surge of attachment. Here's something most people misunderstand. Avoidants don't leave because they don't care. They leave because they care and don't know how to regulate it. Intensity without regulation feels destabilizing, and destabilization feels like identity erosion because their identity is built around being steady, independent, unaffected. When love affects them deeply, it contradicts who they believe they are. That contradiction creates internal dissonance. I don't need anyone, but they feel like they do. I'm better on my own, but they miss you. I don't get attached, but your absence hurts. That identity fracture is deeply uncomfortable, and rather than rebuild identity, the system removes the trigger. Distance is easier than reconstruction. You might have sensed that the closer you got, the more fragile they seemed. Not fragile emotionally, fragile structurally, as if their composure was harder to maintain. That's because attachment was poking at parts of them they never integrated. Dependency needs, fear of abandonment, fear of engulfment, fear of inadequacy, fear of being seen too clearly. When intimacy grows, those buried parts surface. And if someone hasn't done deep internal work, surfacing feels threatening. So they pull back to restabilize, not because you were wrong, but because you were penetrating defenses that kept them intact. This is why it often feels like the more loving you became, the more distant they grew, because love increases visibility, and visibility is terrifying to someone who survived by staying partially hidden. They don't just fear losing you, they fear losing the version of themselves that never needed anyone, and that version has been protecting them for a very long time. So when you ask, why did he leave? right when it felt secure. The answer isn't rejection, it's activation. You activated attachment. Attachment activated fear. Fear activated distancing. It's a sequence. Predictable. Nervous system driven. Not personal. And understanding that is the first step toward detaching your worth from their withdrawal. Because what happened was not about your value. It was about their capacity. And capacity is something love cannot force. It has to be built. And until it is built, real intimacy will continue to feel like something to escape instead of something to stay in. After they pull away, something strange happens. There is relief, and there is grief. At the same time, relief, because the activation quiets down. Grief, because the connection was real. This is the part no one talks about. When an avoidant leaves, at the height of intimacy, it is not clean inside them. It is conflicted. Their nervous system feels calmer. Once distance is created, the pressure in their chest softens. The constant internal scanning eases. They can think clearly again. They can sleep again. They can regulate again. Distance restores control, and control restores safety. But attachment does not disappear just because space exists. Attachment doesn't dissolve on command. It lingers, quietly, under the surface. You might assume that if they left, they must feel free, untouched, unaffected. But what they actually feel is complexity. They may miss your presence in small, ordinary moments. A song, a routine, a place you both went, a specific tone of your voice. They may reach for their phone and stop themselves, not because they don't care, but because reaching reopens activation. And activation is what they just escaped. Here's what's important to understand. When you became real to them, you created an imprint, not surface chemistry, not casual attraction. An imprint. Imprints are different. They are encoded at the level of the nervous system, which means even if they cognitively justify leaving, their body remembers what it felt like to be emotionally met. And being emotionally met is rare for someone avoidant. They may not admit that. They may downplay it. They may convince themselves it wasn't that deep. But the body doesn't lie. If you were the first person to make them feel seen, without suffocating them, safe, without demanding them, understood, without overwhelming them, that matters, even if they ran, especially if they ran, because running usually signals that something meaningful was activated. If it were casual, they wouldn't need distance. If it were shallow, they wouldn't need protection. Depth requires defense. When someone lacks regulation, after they leave, the mind takes over. The mind tries to reframe. It wasn't compatible. It was too intense. She wanted too much. He expected too much. It wasn't sustainable. The narrative shifts to justify the nervous system's choice. Because admitting, I cared more than I could handle, feels vulnerable. And vulnerability is exactly what they were avoiding. You, on the other hand, are left with confusion because your system leans toward closeness. When intimacy deepens, you relax. When attachment forms, you feel safer. So when they retreat, at the exact moment, you feel secure. It destabilizes you. It makes you question your perception, your intensity, your worth. But here's the truth. You did not destabilize them because you were too much. You destabilized them because you became significant. Significance activates attachment. Attachment activates fear. In someone who equates love with loss of autonomy, and autonomy is their core identity. When they left, it wasn't because you stopped mattering. It was because you mattered enough to disrupt their internal balance. and disruption feels threatening before it feels transformative. Some avoidants circle back, not because they changed overnight, but because distance created safety, and safety allows longing to resurface. When activation drops, the positive memories return, the warmth, the connection, the ease, without the intensity of full closeness. That's why you may see them reappear. Once you stop reaching, once you stop regulating, once you detach, because your detachment lowers the threat level. You are no longer emotionally demanding proximity. You are no longer signaling dependency. You are no longer mirroring their vulnerability back at them. And in that lowered activation state, they can feel again. But here's the part that matters. If nothing changes internally, the cycle repeats. Closeness, activation, fear, distance, relief, longing, return. And unless someone develops the capacity to tolerate sustained intimacy, real love will always trigger the same escape response. You might wonder if they ever think about what they lost. The answer is often yes. But thinking and acting are not the same. An avoidant can feel regret and still remain distant. They can miss you and still choose silence because action requires re-entering vulnerability, and vulnerability is what their system flags as danger. This is why closure rarely feels satisfying with someone avoidant. Their explanation will sound rational, surface level, almost clinical, because they explain from cognition, not from the body. They will say, "It just didn't feel right. I need space. I can't give what you want." And on the surface, that sounds like incompatibility. But underneath is often dysregulation. You became real. Real means attachment. Attachment means vulnerability. Vulnerability means risk. And risk activates survival wiring. When someone leaves, because intimacy activated them, it doesn't erase the intimacy. It freezes it. It suspends it, which is why months later, sometimes years later, they can still feel something when they think of you, not because you haunted them, but because you reached a layer few people reach. You touched the part they protect most. And even if they never say it, that matters. The danger is this. You can romanticize the imprint. You can believe, if I mattered that much, maybe I should wait. But imprint is not the same as readiness. Being unforgettable does not mean being chosen. Being significant does not mean being sustained. What makes you powerful in this story is not that you activated them. It's that you now understand what happened. You were not rejected because you lacked something. You were distanced from because you activated something. And those are two very different truths. One attacks your worth. The other reveals their limitation. When you internalize that, you stop chasing closure from someone who cannot give you nervous system safety. You stop trying to shrink, so you feel less activating. You stop believing that being easier would have made them stay, because ease was never the issue. Depth was, and depth requires capacity. Now we come to the part that actually matters. Not why they left, not what they felt, not whether they'll come back, but what this did to you. Because when someone leaves, at the moment you felt safe, it doesn't just hurt. It destabilizes trust. Trust in them. Trust in timing. Trust in your own perception. You replay the closeness, the softness, the promises that weren't promises, but felt like direction. And you question everything. Was it real? Did I imagine it? How can something feel secure and disappear overnight? Here is the grounding truth. It was real. It was just real beyond their current capacity. And when someone lacks capacity, they will retreat. The moment love demands emotional presence, instead of emotional potential. But what often happens next is subtle and dangerous. You start editing yourself. You tell yourself to be less expressive next time, less vulnerable, less available, less invested. You decide, I won't open up that fast again. I won't talk about the future. I won't show how much I care. But shrinking is not healing, it's self protection. And if you build your next connection from self protection, and if you build your next connection from self protection, you recreate the same instability in a different form. The real work is not becoming smaller, it's becoming regulated. Because what their withdrawal activated in you is your own attachment system. When someone pulls away at the height of intimacy, your body goes into pursuit mode, not because you're desperate, because you were attached. And attachment loss activates anxiety. Your nervous system wants restoration, contact, clarity, resolution. So you feel urgency. You feel the need to explain yourself, to fix it, to prove your steadiness. But here's the shift. You do not regulate yourself through someone who destabilized you. You regulate yourself within yourself. That means sitting with the discomfort without chasing relief. That means letting the silence exist without filling it. That means tolerating the ache of uncertainty without trying to collapse it with contact. When you do that, something powerful happens. You stop associating love with anxiety. You stop confusing chemistry with nervous system activation. You begin to recognize that real safety does not disappear when intimacy deepens. It stabilizes. If someone only feels safe when things are undefined, that is not secure attachment. That is controlled distance. And you deserve a connection that strengthens when it becomes real, not one that fractures. Here's the deeper truth. When you became real to them, you proved something to yourself. You are capable of deep intimacy. You are capable of emotional presence. You are capable of loving without games. That is not weakness. That is capacity. Their exit does not reduce your capacity. It reveals theirs. And when you stop personalizing their nervous system reaction, you reclaim your stability. You stop trying to decode mixed signals. You stop waiting for someone to feel brave enough to choose you. You become selective. You begin asking different questions. Not, do they like me? But, do they have the capacity to stay present when this becomes real? That question changes everything. Because love is not tested in attraction, it is tested in activation. When closeness deepens, does this person expand or contract? Do they communicate or disappear? Do they lean in or look for exits? Those answers matter more than chemistry ever will. If someone leaves, when intimacy activates, let them go without rewriting your worth. Because chasing someone who retreats from depth only teaches your nervous system that love equals instability. And that imprint is not one you want to carry forward. What makes you unforgettable is not pursuit, it's composure, it's grounded presence, it's the ability to feel deeply without collapsing into reaction. When you stop chasing, when you stop explaining, when you stop shrinking, you interrupt the cycle. And whether they come back or not becomes secondary because your stability is no longer dependent on their availability. That is power, quiet power, the kind that doesn't beg to be recognized, the kind that doesn't perform to be chosen, the kind that understands. If someone cannot hold depth, they will always feel safest on the surface. And you are not here to live on the surface. You are here for real connection, And real connection requires two nervous systems capable of tolerating closeness without interpreting it as danger. So if they left, when you became real, don't regret becoming real. Refine your discernment instead. Let this teach you what activation looks like, what capacity looks like, what avoidance feels like in its early stages. So next time, you don't just feel chemistry, you feel regulation. You feel consistency. When vulnerability rises, you feel steadiness. When intimacy deepens, and you choose accordingly. Because the goal is not to be unforgettable. The goal is to be met. If this resonated, stay close to this work, not to analyze them, but to strengthen you. Because the more regulated you become, the less you will mistake withdrawal for destiny, and the more you will recognize that the right connection does not retreat the moment you become real.